You've probably heard sake called rice wine plenty of times before, whether you've been in a store and maybe you're going down a wine aisle and usually they'll have sake in like the Japanese or Asian section, or if you're online shopping for sake and you have to click on a tab and you look at rice wine. Sometimes they have it under wines instead of liquors, or sometimes they have it under beer. A lot of times they have it under wine. The problem is it's wrong. Sake is not like wine pretty much by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, when you really start to break it down and look at the techniques, the processes, and even some of the terminology and the decision making that has to go into making a bottle of sake, you'll understand that there's a lot more in common with beer than there is with wine. And if you know your way around a pint of beer and you understand a lot of the beer jargon and what goes into making some really good beer, then you're probably a lot more knowledgeable on what goes into making good sake than you probably assumed before you clicked on this video. My name is Michael and welcome to Sips on Sake. My credentials are I've drank a lot of sake. Welcome to the channel. All right, so let's first break down why sake is closer to beer and not wine. And it really comes down to a simple thing, and that's sugar. You see, in wine, grapes already have the sugar necessary to go from sugar to alcohol. You just basically add the yeast, bing, bam, thank you, ma'am. But in sake, because what's used to make sake is rice, you have starch, you don't have sugar. So you need to go from starch to sugar to alcohol. Beer has malted barley, sake has koji, but both of them have the same job of converting starch into sugar so that sugar can then be converted into alcohol. Think about the range of beers that you've had in the past, from lagers to IPAs to saisons. They're all largely made from about the same things, but they all taste widely different. Sake is pretty much the same. A lot of it is made pretty much just from rice, water, yeast, and koji, but you go from light and fruity to more full-bodied and savory. So a lot of the kind of decision matrix and considerations that you make in choosing a beer, you can directly apply that one for one into choosing the sake that's perfect for you, and we're gonna break that down one by one. Let's do it. All right, so in beer, you have what's called your grain bill, and that is essentially setting the base character of your brew. The more roasted malt you have in your beer, the more complex, darker, and kind of, say thicker profile you're gonna be getting as far as flavors. And the less roasted malt you put into the grain bill, the more lighter, kind of clean, delicate profile you're gonna get with the brew. For sake, you have what's called the rice polishing ratio. And what that essentially is sake is made from rice. So in order to get the profile, the flavor profile that the brewmaster wants, they start polishing away the outer layers of the rice grains. And the more that's polished away, the closer you're getting to the starchy center of the rice grains, or the shinpaku. And it's essentially, again, this is the one-to-one, if you will. The more you polish away, the lighter, the cleaner, and sometimes more, let's say, fruit leaning you get on the flavor profile of a sake. The polishing ratio is often printed somewhere on the label of a sake. So if you see a 60%, that means 40% of the rice grains were polished away. If you see a 50%, that means 50% of the rice grains were polished away. All right, so let's move on to the next one-to-one as far as beer to sake. And this is one that beer people ask about a lot. Is there a, kind of correlation from IBUs in beer to, something equivalent in sake? And the short answer is yes, except it measures sweetness and dryness versus bitterness. It's called the Nihonshu Do, or sake meter value, SMV for short. And it works on a scale that runs from negative numbers on the sweet end to positive numbers on the dry end, with 0 being neutral. And so a sake that is at -4 is sweet, and a sake at +10 is very dry. The shorthand, or the way I always remember it, is if it's higher, it's drier. And just like most systems, when you're trying to describe something as complex as taste and how these things translate on a palate, these things aren't perfect. So just like IBUs aren't perfect in beer, SMV isn't perfect in sake either. This doesn't necessarily account for acidity. So something that's very acidic but isn't necessarily an indication of, isn't something that's going to translate on the sweetness or dryness scale, because that's a specific measurement. So something that has high acidity can taste a lot drier than its SMV value would kind of lead you to believe it. And obviously inversely, something that's a very low acidity might taste a lot sweeter than its SMV value might lead you to believe. So you can really think of it as about as useful as IBUs are for a beer. It's a good shorthand, and it's information that is useful, but it's not going to be a surefire indication of what's actually going on or how that's actually going to translate on the palate. All right, let's look at the next concept that overlaps between sake and beer, and that is pasteurization. If you've ever had unpasteurized beer, whether that's straight from the brewery or genuine draft beer, you know that it's a different experience than the normal pasteurized mass market beer that's on the shelves, because most of the stuff that's from the major breweries are pasteurized. But if you've ever had unpasteurized beer, you know that there is a difference. And sake has a similar concept, and it's called namazake, which really just means unpasteurized sake or raw sake. And with this, you get it's more of a, it's definitely a noticeable difference from regular sake. It doesn't look any different. Like it's not like it'll look carbonated or anything like that. But you definitely feel a difference on the palate for namazake. And it's usually going to be a little bit more zippy, a lot more lively, and just fresh overall. And that's pretty much what people love about namazake, or the unpasteurized sake, is you get all of that extra oomph in the flavor. The next overlap between sake and beer is filtration. So with beer, most beer is filtered, but you have offshoots, which would be known as like hazy IPAs, that don't go through that filtration process. In sake, you have something similar, and it's called muroka. So muroka sake skip the filtration step, and it's, again, as you see why I wanted to do this video and make this comparison, it's pretty much a 1-for-1. Filtration, the charcoal filtration step on sake is skipped for a muroka, and it's not as, I'd say, as dramatic of a difference between it's not as dramatic as like a namazake versus a regular sake for muroka to non-muroka, but there is a change in kind of like greater intensity and flavor of muroka sake versus non-muroka sake. I do want to make sure something doesn't get confused. So this is specifically talking about filtration. So muroka is about filtration. For nigori, for those people that are familiar with sake and you've maybe seen cloudy sake, that is related to the pressing phase of sake. So for nigori, that just means that in the pressing phase, the kind of grate that they use is a bit more coarse, and so it allows more of the rice solids to kind of get through into the final product. That is not the filtration process. So I don't want people to confuse nigori and muroka. They're different. They're different results from different phases of the sake brewing process. All right, so moving on to the next overlap between beer and sake, and that is cask strength / genshu. So for most sake, it is diluted with water to bring it from that 18 to 20% down to about 14% for most sake. The overlap with beer in this specific area is where you'd have like your imperials or your double IPAs that are going to have those higher ABVs and kind of give you that old warming effect as it goes down the old gullet. Genshu sakes pretty much work the same way. Because it's not diluted, you're going to get a lot more intensity of flavor. And after going through the other two, as far as nama for unpasteurized and muroka for unfiltered, you do tend to see all three of these things appear in one specific sake. So you will see a muroka nama genshu, and that is basically the sake in its purest expression. For beer, you can basically think of this as an imperial, hazy, unfiltered, fresh draft. These sake pack a lot of flavor in all of the right ways, and if you find an opportunity to get you a muroka nama genshu sake, go ahead and jump on it, and if nothing else, it'll be something you really remember, if not thoroughly enjoy. Given that this video is about the parallels between beer and sake, I do want to highlight and be upfront about the things that don't translate directly from beer to sake. And one of the first things is temperature. Sake, especially, the junmais and the kimotos and the yamahai styles, you can mess around with temperature as far as like warming some of these up and getting a completely different but still pleasant experience from these sakes. You don't really want to mess around warming up too many beers. Even room temperature beer for a lot of people is just a non-starter, but that is one of those things that doesn't translate well between sake and beer. Another thing that doesn't really translate very well is the yeast starter methods from beer to sake. So specifically going back again to kimoto and yamahai when we're talking about yeast starter, without getting into too far of the weeds and without speaking of things that maybe are a bit out of my own depth, actually, just know that when you see kimoto or yamahai on a sake, that's a more labor intense and kind of, let's say, wild process than a traditional sake would normally go through. Sake made from kimoto and yamahai styles are basically cultivated using lactic acid bacteria that naturally occurs within a brewery, which is a bit different than anything that goes on with beer. And lastly, there's no hops in sake, if this wasn't obvious enough already. Bitterness in beer comes from hops, but any bitterness in sake actually just comes from the amino acids from the rice. So it's not really something that the brewmaster is manipulating in one sake from another. And this is again going back to why there's no, why IBU for beer doesn't exactly translate to bitterness for sake in that way. It's sweetness and dryness, because it just, the bitterness that occurs in sake is just not the same as far as the bitterness that occurs in beer, which is hops derived. So now what do you do with all this information if you want to really give sake a chance and you know a thing or two about beer? Next time you're standing in front of a sake selection, look for these things in order. If you want something that's very aromatic and light on the palate, then you want to be looking for a genjo or a dai genjo. If you want something that's big in flavor, you want to be looking for a junmai, a kimoto style, or a yamahai style sake. If you want something that's a lot just really clean and crisp and kind of refreshing, that's when you want to look for a hanjozo, but not necessarily a dai genjo or a genjo. Then you want to start looking for muroka or nama or genshu. These are essentially the modifiers to the style. So you could have a junmai nama or a dai genjo genshu, nama genshu, or muroka, a dai genjo, muroka, nama genshu. That's after you find the style, then you want to kind of see if maybe you can find something that's going to be giving you something, a raw expression of a sake. Third, you might want to turn the bottle around, or depending on the style, you want to see if you can discern what the SMV is, and that's going to be whether it's going to be a negative or a positive number. Remember, again, if it's higher, it's drier, so the higher positive number it is, the more dry the sake is being indicated to be. And the lower it is, the more negative it is. That's the sweeter it's supposed to be. But remember, this does not tell you about the acidity, so this is why this is the third part on the list. And fourth is kind of a bonus. If you're out at a restaurant and you obviously don't have all the bottles in front of you, you can ask whoever is responsible for getting you something to drink, whether it's a waiter or waitress, or if you're at some sushi restaurant, just ask, you know, the chef or whoever what they recommend. Or if you want something savory and full-bodied, you can ask for that. Or if you want something light and aromatic, you can ask for that, and they'll get you taken care of. So you came into this video thinking sake was a rice wine, something kind of close to a Chardonnay or maybe even a Cabernet or something. But now you know it's less like a wine and more like a beer. There's a lot of the same principles, a lot of the same methodology, and though obviously different languages, a lot of the terminology translates pretty well into informing you what's in the bottle of a sake. And now you know, koji is the malt, SMV is the IBU, sort of. Namazake is the fresh draft, muroka is the hazy, genshu is the imperial, and the four types map onto the same spectrum you already navigate every time you open a tap list. Sake isn't hard, it just really needed the right translation. And if you already understood beer, you kind of had the codex, if you will. But now that you're that much smarter, I do want to hear from you. What is your style of beer? I'm not a huge beer drinker myself. I'm gonna be honest, I had to do a lot of research for this video to understand some of the terms and how they translate into sake. So I'm curious what people's styles of beer are and what do they recommend based on kind of having a better understanding of sake. What would you recommend for me to try? You know, if I'm somebody that really likes the muroka nama genshus, the strong sakes, what would you recommend to me? What would you recommend for me to try as far as beer goes? But leave those comments down below, and I'll maybe if I get something very specific, I'll try and incorporate some beer that's recommended in a future video. But with all that being said, that's pretty much everything for this video. I'm just gonna wrap it up there before I start rambling. I do wanna say that the next video is gonna be very important. It is gonna be on it is gonna be on the most common bottle of sake in the United States, and that is the Gekkeikan Traditional Junmai. I got that right on the first take. It is the Gekkeikan Traditional Junmai, and I really wanna just put that bottle in the forefront and go over everything about it, because for a lot of people it is the bottle that they see the most, and for a lot of people it is the bottle that it may be the only bottle that they've tried outside of, you know, some random experience at a sushi restaurant. So that is going to be the next video. If you don't want to miss that, make sure you subscribe to the channel so that you're notified when that is uploaded, because I think you don't want to miss that one. But that's everything. So until the next time, we'll keep sipping, we'll keep learning. But until then,